So when we look at history, typically, for me, what I like to cover is the history of dogma, the history of doctrine. How did we come to believe the things we believe? Who came up with the word Trinity? Where did we start talking about is communion the physical body of Jesus, or is it not? And why did anyone ever think it was? And why do so many people still think it is? And what do they even mean? I would like to know where ideas came from so that we know where we fit in this sort of family tree of ideas that is the church's teaching through the centuries. You get people who say the church's teaching has always been the same forever and never changed, and they have a very difficult time proving that. And then you get people who say there's no consistency at all. I like to know, what does the church believe? Do I fit into it? Am I a real part of it? Am I acceptable within the tradition? If I met these Christians, would they, as Peter did to Paul, extend the right hand of fellowship? Or would they say, you think you're a Christian and you do that? You believe what about Jesus? Today, we're not going to cover anything that intense. We're going to cover things that, for the most part, don't matter at all. And you might think, why are we doing a Sunday school on things that don't matter? I think it's very important as Christians that we think through, how do we listen? How do we read? I see a problem all over the place where Christians read the news in a way that doesn't reflect that they're Christians. Because we've got these extremes. If the news supports a political position that I like, then I read it very uncritically, without any suspicion, and I repeat it without thinking. If the news is written from a perspective that doesn't bolster what I already think, then I'm highly critical. They probably made up all the facts and misrepresented everybody in question. How can we as Christians, when we're reading history, or when we're reading the news, or when we're listening to anybody, how ought we to listen? There's a song, I don't know if you were taught this. When I was a kid, they had this song we always sang. Be careful, little eyes, what you see. Be careful, little ears. Be careful, your mind, what you think. And it's not really that you can actually... I mean, if your eyes see something, you can't prevent it. But the idea is, how do you interpret? What sense do you make of the world? So I'm going to talk about today things that don't matter as much as examples for us to think through. How do we receive history as Christians? And I'm really using history because history is politics. And a lot of people have political opinions. But those political opinions are usually constrained to the present. And most people don't have strong opinions about what happened in the first century. And so this is an area where we don't have biases already working against us as much. And we can think through, without the difficulty, how ought we as Christians to read? How ought we to think? So, I'm going to start today. Who's heard of Eusebius of Caesarea? All right, he is the father of church history, or so-called. He is the first Christian ever to sit down and intentionally write a book on church history. He wrote in roughly 326 AD. And he gets a lot of flack from modern historians because, well, he's not a modern historian. He doesn't have their standards. He doesn't have their aims. He was not as critical of his sources as you might like a modern historian to be, especially when it comes to dates of events. Everything happened in the day that somebody said it happened, even if it doesn't fit with something else he said. He was just receiving and passing on what was given to him, which is good. He lets you make the decisions. He's also not as reliable when it comes to heretics, because in his view, heretics are ruled by the devil, and all their ideas are dumb. Nowadays, we'd look back and think the church's doctrines developed in response to heretics who were themselves deep thinkers and pushed the church to think deeply. That's how we grow today. Everything I know because of the liberals. If I hadn't gone to a liberal school, I never would have gone to Miller. I never would have devoted my life to studying the Bible. It was bad ideas that pushed me to think through the biblical ideas. And that's how we're in church history. But regardless, Eusebius, for his time, was excellent. He was extraordinarily well read. He could not just cite sources, but say, this source never mentions X event. And he's always right. Whenever we have that source, like he'll mention Josephus. Have you ever seen the complete works of Josephus? It's a lot of writing. We have it in English translations, but still, that's a lot of writing. And Herodotus, he was familiar enough with all of his sources to say, this author never mentions this, and be right, consistently. And back before the printing press, to have read everything, you had to find a copy somewhere. So he was living at a time, this is after Constantine had legalized Christianity, that he does this writing. And a lot of he also gets flack because he super praised Constantine. He's got full books on just how awesome the emperor is. And it's like, is he paying you? Yeah, probably. Anyway, all of the information we're going to go over today comes from Eusebius. Probably, mostly. Sort of, not really. I mention him because last week I mentioned a book by Bishop Lightfoot called The Apostolic Fathers. It's a collection of all of the earliest writings that we have. We don't have very many writings from the time directly after the apostles, but we have a few, and you can get them in a single volume of very readable books. I mean, if you can read Paul, they're easier than Paul. Much easier. Same style. Eusebius also. I've got a copy on my shelf. It's only this thick. It's one book. It covers the first 300 years of church history. I'm going to share some stories with you today from that book. But I want you to know there's some things he says that are obviously true and some things that are obviously false. And what I want us to think about is, what do we do with the stuff in the middle? Because that's usually what we're dealing with when we read the news and when we listen to, even if you're in the pew listening to me do a sermon. You know, I say some things that are obviously right. I'm sure I say things that are obviously wrong, and you go, oh, he said Jeremiah. He obviously meant Ezekiel. And then I'll say things just like, you don't know. What do you do with that? So, a couple things that are obviously true. One is, the early church spread fast. Unbelievably fast. And I want to tell you about it just because it's exciting. You know, in 30 AD, how many people are in the church? Well, there's 12, maybe 132, you know, the 120 at the upper room. And then Pentecost, same year, you've moved to 3,000. And by the time Paul's writing, there's already a church in Rome. Probably it was founded on the day of Pentecost, because people came from all over the empire. So on the day that the church was founded, it already existed across Europe. But those churches spread, and Paul went out. But Paul wasn't the only one who went out. So Luke records all these missionary journeys of Paul, but Paul didn't invent missionary journeys. He wasn't the first, and he wasn't the last. Eusebius says that so many Christians went out. In fact, the way he put it was, most of the disciples sold everything they had, gave to the poor, and fulfilled the office of evangelists. Paul's the one that we all remember, but there were so many people like him that Eusebius says it would be impossible for me to tell you all of them. So what he did is he said, I'll just tell you the ones whose writings we still have. And here's why I say it's obviously true. Because most of the writings that he still had, we still have. So we go, yeah, those are the ones whose writings we still have. And no doubt he was right, based on how quickly the church spread, that there were many, many others. To give you a sense of how quickly, by the year 197, end of the 2nd century, Tertullian is... he's one of the African apologists. He said that there were more Christians in any given Roman state than there were in the soldiers in the entire Roman army. And he's probably exaggerating. But, I mean, like, how would he know, right? But he's not laughed at. That's not a stupid idea. By the year 380, Chrysostom, he's in Antioch, he says that there are 100,000 Christians in Antioch alone, which, if he's right, would be about half the city is Christian. Christianity went from being a minority position in Jerusalem to being the majority position in major world capitals all across Europe within the span of a few hundred years. That's obviously true. Then there's stuff Eusebius says that's obviously false. I'll give you an example. He says that the church spread so fast that within the lifetime of the apostles, a monastic order had been established in Alexandria that was so rigorous in their spiritual devotion that Philo wrote about it. Now, Philo wrote around the same time as Paul, so this would be extremely early. Here's how we know it's obviously not true. Philo does record this group. He calls them the Therapeutae. He doesn't say that they're Christians. They have some kind of scriptures, so scholars are disagreed. Were these Jewish Essenes? Was this some sort of Greek philosophical order? It's unclear. Well, I think probably Jewish, but they were certainly very monastic. But the way we know that they're not Christian is Philo says that, and Eusebius repeats it, they had grown old doing this their entire life. If we're looking at the year 35 AD, the church was started 5 years ago. There is no way you've got a church in Alexandria full of old ladies who grew up serving Jesus with their whole heart. It's only been 5 years. There's no church there. It doesn't make any sense. But Eusebius he quotes it and says it's obvious to everybody that this is about Christians. And I go, it's not obvious to me that that's even possible. So you got some things like that where all scholars today unanimously and for good reason say he was wrong, but good thing he showed us his sources so we could check up on it. How are we doing so far? This is all new stuff to you, going over your heads maybe a bit. All right, talk about some of the things that are less clear. I'll give you some broad overview stuff, what happened to all the apostles, and then we'll spend our time just on two things, really. What happened to Peter and Paul, and what happened to John. For the most part, we don't know what happened to most of the apostles. We don't know what happened to the 70. There are legends that spring up. The later you go into the church, the more legends spring up and the more contradictory there are. Andrew is an interesting case because it's some of it's early enough that we're not quite sure. The earliest tradition seems to be that Scythia, you know where Scythia is, around the Black Sea, southern Russia. Scythia was Andrew's domain, so he was sent there, and so for that reason he's the patron saint today of Russia. But they also say he was crucified in Greece, so he's the patron saint of Greece. Eventually he became the patron saint of Scotland, but nobody said he went there until like the year 700 and something, so probably not. But you get early traditions that Andrew went to Scythia, John went to Asia, Asia meaning the Roman province, not China. Asia would be more Turkey. Thomas went to Parthia. Here's an interesting one. I wasn't going to share this one, but it's interesting to me. There's an early story that beyond the Euphrates, King Agabus in Edessa heard about Jesus while he was doing all of his miracles and sent a courier to Jesus and said, please come and heal. I can't remember if he was sick or if somebody he knew was sick, but Jesus apparently wrote him a letter back personally and said, and we still have copies of this letter. Most people think Jesus didn't write it, but we still have it. And said, it's not the time. After I've ascended, then I will send a disciple your way, and you'll be healed, and everything will be good. And according to the legend goes, Thomas sent Thaddeus over there, and a whole bunch of people were saved, and they founded a church. You get stories like this, where... I forget where I was going with that. Point being, the gist of it is, though the details are a little historically blurry now, the disciples all went all over the place. Eusebius is probably right that most of them sold everything they had and did what Paul did. Whether they did it by the time Paul did it, or later on, most of them seem to, and a lot of others that aren't named, and the 70. I do want to give opportunity if there's questions on any of that, because I know I'm flying through stuff here.
It's all good. It's all good.
All right, we'll talk about Paul and Peter. So, you've heard that Peter was crucified upside down. I don't know if that's true. The evidence is very scanty. According to the Acts of Peter, if you want to put any stock in that, it's very fanciful. If you read the Acts of Peter, it's filled with the kinds of stories that... You know how when you read a fiction novel, it's interesting and keeps your attention? And when you read the Bible, it's harder? Well, this is in the direction of interesting. The details are decorative rather than theological. But at one point, these acts were considered... they were read in the churches, and they were considered disputed books, not just nonsense books. Some Christians thought there was something to them. And the few details we do have correspond to what people said happened. Namely, that Simon Magus, you know Simon Magus? He's in the Bible, though he's not called that. Simon in Acts, you remember when this magician sees... Simon the sorcerer? Yeah, Simon the sorcerer. Magus just means sorcerer. You might think he's a minor character. For the early church, he was a major character, and they considered him historically the father of all heresies. They thought that there might be some truth to it, because Rome is the place where all ideas get spread. And he went to Rome, apparently, right after... It's debatable when he went to Rome. Probably right after Peter said, you're in the gall of Satan. He went to Rome, and as the story goes, he had these showdowns with Peter that remind you of Elijah and the prophets of Baal, because he wanted to convert everyone to his way of looking at things and sorcery, and Peter wanted to show them the gospel. Probably a lot of it's fanciful, but it's attested to by enough of the early church that there's a good chance they were both there. The question would be when. Here's an area where I think we have to be careful. You might not have strong opinions about some of this stuff, but it is an area where people do have strong opinions, and so we have to be careful as we think through. And it's fine not to be sure, right? You don't have to say, I believe Peter was definitely in Rome in the reign of Claudius, or I believe he didn't go until the reign of Nero, or whatever. There are some... Well, I'll start here. Jerome gives the account that Peter was the Pope for 25 years in Rome. Now, most Catholic scholars, and maybe not most, Catholic scholars today, at least some of them will admit, there's no way that's true. 25 years is just... That doesn't fit with anything else we know about what Peter did in his life. But the Catholics will insist that Peter was the Pope, despite... I've read all the earliest guys. I haven't found any reference to Peter being Pope. I have found significant references to Peter and Paul working together to establish and found the church at Rome and appointing bishops, as they do everywhere else. So what we have is the Catholics make a really strong, really not strong, but they're dogmatic that Peter was the Pope. And sometimes what Protestants will do to counteract that as strongly as possible is say, Peter never went to Rome, ever. Now, there's some reason you might think that. One would be, if Peter was in Rome, why doesn't Paul mention Peter in Romans? If Peter was in Rome, why doesn't Paul mention Peter in 2 Timothy when he's about to die in Rome? And it's not like he doesn't mention anybody. It sounds like he goes through the litany of everybody he knows in Romans 16. So that might be evidence he was never there. It might be evidence he just wasn't there yet. And there's a bit of evidence that is taken two ways. You know what Peter says he writes from with Mark? Remember where he says? He says they send you greetings from Babylon. You remember that? No?
I don't remember that.
Well, in Peter's epistles, he mentions that he sends them greetings from Babylon. The early church and Catholics are agreed that that was a reference to Rome, because Rome is the great superpower that Babylon in the Old Testament represented, the persecutor of the saints. I think that that's probably true. But some people will say, no, Peter couldn't be in Rome because that would leave this slight chance that he's the Pope. So, no, Babylon is just Babylon on the Euphrates, far in the east, far, far away from Rome. Here's what I do with it. I see Eusebius says he went to Rome. Irenaeus, writing much earlier, says he was in Rome. Justin Martyr, writing much earlier than him still, says he was in Rome. The unanimous consent was that he was in Rome. They can't agree on when he went. Some people say he went in the reign of Claudius. Some people say he went in the reign of Nero. But I have no reason. Here's the principle I use. Do unto others as you would have others do unto you. I want to apply that principle when I'm reading. And I have no reason to malign the early Christians and say, they're just lying about Peter being in Rome. They made up the story. I don't know why, but for some reason. Now, it's one thing when you have a source that is demonstrably unreliable. But when you have a source like Eusebius or Irenaeus, they have some blunders. I've shared a couple of Eusebius's. Irenaeus has his own. Irenaeus says that Jesus died at the age of 46. And you go, okay, that doesn't work.
You don't want to throw the baby up with bathwater.
Yeah. Yeah, that doesn't work. But, he wrote 5 volumes worth of stuff that is mostly fantastic. So a little blunder here and there. The worst part is he said that John told him. It's like, is this a typo? It's not a typo. Nobody knows what he's talking about. But you get blunders, but we don't want to evil surmise with the early church just because it would be convenient. It would be very convenient for me as a Protestant to say Peter never went to Rome. But as an honest person, looking at the evidence, I go, if they all say he went to Rome, I want to be even-handed, and if I'm going to be suspicious of somebody, I've got to be suspicious of everybody, unless I've got good reason. That make sense? And I'm sharing this because I think we need to think through this stuff, because the news and the media is constantly blaring in our faces. But so, Simon Magus, he's seen as the father of heresy. Peter and Paul are widely attested to have worked together in Rome. And also, interestingly, they're said to have worked together in Corinth and elsewhere in Italy. Most people don't think they were in Corinth, but the only witnesses who say he were in Corinth were in Corinth. The Corinthian bishops thought that they were there. So, possible. Paul mentions in 1 Corinthians, some say I follow Paul, some say I follow Cephas, some say I follow Apollo. You get the sense Paul and Apollo worked together. I planted, Apollos watered. Maybe Cephas did something too. Maybe that's why he's mentioned. Could be. We've only got one source on that, though. They both die under Nero. I don't know whether Peter was crucified upside down. I don't find that source to be very reliable. But there's widespread attestation that he was crucified and Paul was beheaded, both in the reign of Nero. Tertullian, I mentioned the African apologist, he says that this is a great commendation of the church. Because if you know anything about Nero, you know that he would only destroy something if it was really wonderful. Do you know, who knows anything about Nero? Anybody?
Well, the burning of
Yeah, that's a famous one.
Yeah.
Today, I was just talking to a friend this morning who just went to the Vatican. And he said they built the Vatican, as far as I can tell, St. Peter's Basilica, right on the place where Nero once burned the Christians as torches for his dinner parties. Yeah, Nero's the sort of guy, he killed his brother Britannicus. He divorced his first wife, Octavia, so that he could marry his friend Otho's wife, Poppaea. And then Poppaea died because he kicked her while she was pregnant. I think he had another wife that he ordered assassinated while she was on vacation. This sort of guy kills his own family, burns the Christians for fun. The Roman historian Tacitus suggests that when Rome burned, he did it himself and then blamed the Christians. So, they both die, they're both martyred. Just as Jesus said, by the way, in John, Jesus tells Peter that when you're older, they'll take you where they don't want to go and they'll stretch out your hands. Some would say, and that could be, that's fulfilled in crucifixion, because they've spread out his hands. Certainly, he was told that he would die the martyr's death. Questions on Paul, Peter, Rome? Later on, this does become Rome's claim to fame. It doesn't make sense to me. I mean, I think if you're going to pick a place as the center of the church because somebody died there, you'd pick Jerusalem, where Jesus died, and where Jesus said it's impossible that the prophets should die elsewhere. But they pick Rome because Peter died there. Paul died there too, but I guess who cares? No, he goes into it. Questions? Jen, how are you doing? Good.
Interesting.
There's a few things in that story it's a little difficult to be clear of. This next story, I want to share a bit about John because I just love this story. It's said to be handed down. Clement of Alexandria said that it was handed down through the ages and carefully preserved. And Eusebius records it as well, but not. He's not an independent source. He just gets it from Clement. I don't know if it's true, but it's a beautiful story that I have no reason to doubt. The story goes like this. John the Apostle, after he had been exiled to Patmos, eventually Domitian died. Now, Domitian, he's the ruler in the 90s. He persecuted the church quite severely, tried to make them worship the emperor. The early church is unanimous in saying that John was exiled to Patmos and wrote the book of Revelation during Domitian's reign, which would put it in the 90s and make it the latest book of the New Testament by a fair bit, because everything else is pretty much done before 70 AD. I mention that because a lot of people want to say it was earlier. But to say that, they're going against all of the testimony, which, by the way, Irenaeus and Polycarp and Ignatius and them, they're descendants spiritually of John almost directly. Polycarp was trained under John, and Irenaeus was trained under Polycarp. And Irenaeus says it was in 90, which isn't very long ago. So, chances are. Anyway, so after John was in Patmos, he returned to Ephesus, where he had been ministering. And he went to the regions of the Gentiles to appoint bishops and elders in various places. And when he came to a certain city, he was going to appoint someone. He found a young man, pleasing appearance, strong physique, so it's written, and he says to the bishop, I'm entrusting this young man to you for the sake of the Lord. We're going to raise him up. We're going to mentor him. He's going to be a pastor. And so the bishop agrees, and John leaves. While John's away, this young man's doing well. until he falls in with the wrong crowd. He has friends who at first entice him with expensive forms of entertainment. Back then, sin used to be expensive. Nowadays, people can sin on the cheap. And little by little, they pull her into bigger crimes. First, they take him out and they commit robbery at night. Then it gets worse, and his generally positive attitude becomes more and more negative, and he despairs of his own salvation and expects, I've sinned too much at this point. I'm going to suffer a fate just like the rest of these. And he becomes hardened. He becomes a bandit chief, the fiercest and cruelest and meanest of them all. When John finally returns, much later, he says to the bishop, return what you owe me. You've made me an oath. And the bishop is scared. It's like, did I promise him money? He doesn't believe the accusation. Like, there's no way I owe you money. I would remember that. But he also can't not believe John, because, it's John the apostle we're talking about. The last surviving apostle and representative of Jesus Christ. John explains, no, I mean the young man. And the bishop says, oh. He starts to cry. He's dead. And then he explains the whole story. Obviously, he's not really dead, but as good as dead for all intents and purposes for what you're looking for, John. And John doesn't waste any time. Bring me a horse. Somebody show me the way. Where is this guy? And John gets on a horse, rides as fast as he can. He forgets how old he is. He's got to be like 100 by this point. maybe 80, 90. He's old. And he gets on his horse, and we're not sure how long he lived till. They say he lived till the time of, around 117 or so. He might have lived to be 120. We don't know. He gets on his horse and he goes to the bandit camp, and he's immediately taken prisoner. And when he's put before the young man, he says, what are you doing? There's still hope for you. I would gladly lay down my life for you. Take heart. We'll go back right now. Don't be afraid. Jesus Christ has sent me. And the young man does go back. And John stays with that little church and works with them until the young man is fully restored. And then goes back to Ephesus, where eventually he dies. I just love that story. I think it's such a, he's living out the example of the shepherd who goes after the lost sheep, who lays down his life, being willing to risk everything for the sake of one man who's made the wrong calls. I don't know with absolute confidence that Clement was right, that was handed down from the earliest ages. We don't have that many sources from that time. He thought it was, and he was the most educated Christian of his day. Widely respected. He was the founder of the first Christian university, and traveled as an educator. I don't think he would share it if he didn't think it was true. I wouldn't die on the hill that it's true, but I do take it as an example of it's probably what happened. And if nothing else, I will share with the early church in their desire, as Paul says, to keep their eyes on those who walk according to the example you have seen in us. How are we doing? All of the apostles, except John, it is said, suffered as martyrs. They all went out, sold everything they had, and shared the gospel. And the church spread very, very fast. There's a lot of stuff we can't be that sure of. What we do know is we can read what they wrote and see the attitudes. And I think if you read even a short letter, it'll take you 20 minutes. Read one letter that they wrote and you'll see these guys were clearly followers of the same Jesus that I am. They had the same faith we have. the last few minutes, I'd like to just open to discussion. Are there passages you think are helpful to consider how ought we as Christians to behave in the world when we're listening? How ought we to read? I think of honesty. We're told to be sincere. We're told to be as innocent as doves, but as wise as serpents.
Keeping in mind that this world is not our home, we're always looking toward, so that would, help with our thought process.
Yeah. How do you mean?
So going along with, you hear the news and it's just a commentary that's often heard and often heard. There's more out there than just, so you have to be wise, but you can't be part of this world to fall in with everything that everybody's, saying. You have to go back to the Word, and you have to realize this world is not my home. I have a better place to go.
Mm-hmm. Well, I had us open to Acts 17, so let's just look at a little bit there. In verse 10, the brothers immediately sent Paul and Silas away by night to Berea. And when they arrived, they went into the Jewish synagogue. Now, these Jews were more noble than those in Thessalonica. I think what we read next explains why they were more noble. They received the word with all eagerness, examining the scriptures daily to see if these things were so. There's two things there. I often hear one of them pointed to, but there's two attitudes there that I think ought to illustrate, or they ought to mark how we live. One is that they're examining the scriptures to see. They don't just accept everything because Paul said it. And we shouldn't accept everything because Eusebius said it, even if Eusebius is a great guy. There's a level of suspicion that's healthy. You see that in Luke 1 as well. Luke says that he's written these things so that you may have certainty concerning that which you have been taught, Theophilus. We want to understand that when you read something in the news, or you read something in history, or even when you hear something from a great apostle or a pastor, you don't necessarily have certainty. Certainty is something to be pursued. And then there's this attitude. They received it with eagerness. And I think this eagerness probably extended to their searching as well. We should be eager for the truth. There's an eagerness at receiving and a diligence at pursuing. I find that for me, and maybe you differ, I tend to be eager when I'm receiving from people I look up to and think much of, and suspicious. See, they're eager and suspicious of Paul. I'm eager when it's someone I like. I'm suspicious when it's someone I don't. But the pursuit of truth should not be a living out of our own biases and
That's
prejudices.
Kind of normal what people think now, anyway. Isn't
Yeah.
It?
Well, it's not. There's nothing Christian about it. It's just how I am.
Yeah.
Because I'm just like everybody else. But if we're to take every thought captive for Christ, part of that, and if we're to do everything for the glory of Christ, part of that is when you listen to the radio, even when you listen to songs on the radio, when you watch movies, when we listen to anybody, have any conversation, that we are listening as Christians. We know this about speech. We're told everywhere to let the one who speaks speak as though speaking the oracles of God. Will be judged for every idle word. We know that how we speak matters as Christians. But what you speak comes out of what's in your heart. How does stuff get into your heart? So we got to be careful how we listen as well. I'll pray for us and then we'll be done here. Lord God, I thank you that you have founded your church and you have not let the gates of hell prevail against it. That you were with the church in the beginning to give them victory, to bring the gospel to the ends of what then was the known world. And you have remained with us to this day. I thank you that we can, these things have been handed down to us, that we can see you fulfilled your promise. In a world that was impossibly pagan and intolerant, your gospel came and was successful beyond anyone's imagination. Lord, I thank you that you have given us examples to look up to. I thank you that you have given us examples to avoid. I ask that as we continue with this series and as we go through our week, that you would help us to honor you in the way we hear, in the way we read. Help me as I teach on these things to be honest and not to go beyond what I know, not to go beyond evidence, not to be polemic beyond justification, but teach us to be gracious towards one another, especially within the church, but also to all the world, so that your gospel may be adorned with your character. In Jesus' name, amen.